On the morning of January 12th, 1876, the thermometer nailed to the post outside Conrad Halverson's claim shack read 43 degrees below zero. Conrad had been in Pembina County, Dakota Territory for 3 years. He had survived 2 winters already, winters that had tested him in ways that the winters of his childhood in Norway had not, because the Norwegian coast had mountains to break the wind and the sea to moderate the cold, and the northern plains of Dakota had neither. What the northern plains had was distance. Flat, uninterrupted, merciless distance in every direction and wind that came down from Canada with nothing to slow it for 1,000 miles. He had 11 cords of split oak stacked against the south wall of his cabin. He had laid in those 11 cords starting in August, cutting and hauling through September and October. And he had felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has prepared adequately for what is coming. His chimney drew clean and straight. His walls were tight. He had survived the worst this territory could offer, and he had survived it because he was methodical and experienced, and he did not make the kinds of mistakes that killed unprepared men on the frontier. He was, he believed that morning, the most prepared man in Pembina County. 300 yards to the south, where the land sloped gently toward the bend of the Tongue River, and a stand of cottonwoods marked the only significant timber for miles. In any direction, there was a low mound of earth that was nearly invisible against the white of the January landscape. The mound had a door set into its south face and a stovepipe that rose exactly 18 inches above the roofline, and for 3 days that stovepipe had produced no visible smoke. Conrad told his wife Ingrid that morning that the Russian woman had finally done what he had been predicting she would do since the previous May. He told her that someone would need to ride out there come spring to see about a proper Christian burial, and that it was a shame, truly a shame, but that some lessons could only be learned the hard way, and some people were determined to learn them regardless of what their neighbors told them. Ingrid said nothing to this. She had a way of saying nothing that carried more weight than most people's longest speeches, but Conrad had been married to her long enough to have developed a selective immunity to it, and on that particular morning he was focused on the state of his firewood and the depth of the cold pressing against his cabin walls, and he did not notice the specific quality of his wife's silence. He was wrong about the stovepipe. He was wrong about the Russian woman. And in 48 hours, when the temperature dropped to 43 below and the wind came screaming down from Manitoba at 57 miles per hour, he would understand in a way that no amount of his neighbor's warnings had managed to teach him just how wrong a man could be about the particular problem of staying alive on the northern plains of Dakota Territory. Let me tell you about Vera Strelkov, because a woman like this deserves to be told about properly. She arrived in Pembina County in May of 1874, one of 42 homesteaders who filed claims that year under the Homestead Act. She was 31 years old. She spoke English with a Russian accent heavy enough that some of the men at the Grafton Land Office had to ask her to repeat herself, and a few of them had not bothered to ask, and had simply waited for her to finish and then moved on to the next person in line as though she had not spoken at all. She had come alone. Her husband Pavel had died of typhoid fever in a New York rooming house 14 months before she filed her claim, 3 weeks after they had arrived in America together on a ship from Hamburg. She had buried him in a churchyard in Brooklyn with the help of a Russian Orthodox priest who spoke no English either, and she had taken the naturalization papers that had been issued in his name, and she had folded them carefully and put them in the leather satchel that she carried everywhere, and she had looked at the map of the United States that was tacked to the wall of the immigration office, and she had decided that she was going to go to Dakota Territory and file a homestead claim and prove it up and own land, which was the thing that Pavel had crossed an ocean to do and which she was going to do in his name because there was no one else left to do it. She had carried three things with her on the train from New York to Grafton: the leather satchel with Pavel's naturalization papers, a small tarnished icon of Saint Seraphim of Sarov that had hung on the wall of her grandmother's house in Russia, and that she had carried sewn into the lining of her coat since she was 19 years old, and a rolled set of drawings on heavy paper that her grandfather Dmitri had made 30 years before in the province of Saratov Oblast on the Volga River in the years when he had been building the heating system that kept his family and eventually his entire village alive through winters that the people of Pembina County, Dakota Territory had never imagined and would not have believed if she had tried to describe them. The land office clerk in Grafton had asked her about the drawings. She had tried to explain. She had shown him the diagrams, the horizontal channels running beneath the floor of the structure, the firebox in the corner, the long route the smoke and heat traveled before finally exiting through the low pipe. She had tried to find the English words for thermal mass and heat exchange and the way the earth itself could be turned into a battery that absorbed heat and released it slowly over hours and days. The clerk had laughed, not cruelly, the way a man laughs when he has heard something that strikes him as so far outside the range of plausible things that laughter is the only appropriate response. He had laughed and moved on to the next piece of paperwork, and Vera Strelkov had rolled her grandfather's drawings back up and put them in the satchel with Pavel's naturalization papers and walked out of the land office into the May sunshine of Grafton, Dakota Territory. She did not try to explain again. She filed on a quarter section where the Tongue River made a lazy bend. The land had things she needed: a stand of cottonwood along the river for timber, a spring that ran clear and cold year-round, soil that was black loam, deep and rich, the kind of soil that made farmers from poorer ground stop and press their hands into it and close their eyes, and an adjacent claim that had already been taken by a Norwegian immigrant named Conrad Halverson, who would tell her straight out on the second day after she arrived that she would never make it through one winter alone. Conrad was 42 that May, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been shaped by 30 years of physical work into something more like tools than body parts. He was not an unkind man. He had a practical directness that people from colder climates often develop a way of saying the true thing without ornament, because ornament costs time and time has value, and he genuinely believed he was doing her a service by telling her what she faced. His wife Ingrid brought Vera a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves the day after they met, which was a gesture of real generosity on the frontier where supplies were finite and winter was always coming. But the look in Ingrid's eyes when she looked at Vera carried something complicated in it, a mix of sympathy and a kind of sorrow that Vera recognized as the particular sorrow of a woman who sees another woman heading toward difficulty and cannot find the words to redirect her. Oscar Timmermann, who had homesteaded a section to the east, was a German from Saxony, 53 years old, who had built 17 houses in Milwaukee before the financial panic of 1873 had taken everything he had built and sent him west to start again. He understood masonry. He understood construction. He had spent 4 decades learning how buildings worked and how heat moved through materials and what made a structure sound against the specific challenges of cold climates. He looked at Vera's drawings and shook his head with the authority of a man who has earned his opinions through long experience. Cormac Driscoll had come west laying track for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He was 41 Irish-born with 3 years of surviving railroad camp winters in Minnesota and Montana behind him, and he had seen men freeze to death in those camps in ways that had made him careful about cold ever since. He spent 2 full hours one afternoon in August trying to talk Vera out of her plan, standing in her excavation site, while she continued to work around him, explaining all the ways the system could fail, all the ways the smoke could back up and kill her silently in her sleep. Reverend Aldgate, who led services every other Sunday in Conrad's barn, worried about fire. He had lost a sister to a house fire in Ohio, and the worry had never left him. None of them were bad people. This is important to understand. They were experienced people who had survived difficult things, and who had developed through that survival a set of convictions about what worked and what did not work, and those convictions were built on real evidence gathered through real hardship. They believed what they believed because what they believed had kept them alive. What they did not have was Dmitry Strelkov. Vera's grandfather had been born in 1801 in a village on the Volga River in Saratov Oblast in the part of Russia where the winters came from Siberia and lasted half the year and killed people with a regularity that made death in winter not a tragedy, but an expectation, a cost of living in that particular place on that particular earth. Dmitri had been a stonemason and a builder and a man who thought about problems the way a craftsman thinks about them from the inside out, beginning with the properties of the materials and ending with the structure those properties made possible. He had not invented the system he built. The system was older than he was older than his father and his father's father, refined across generations of Russian and Eastern European builders who had faced the same problem he faced and had arrived independently and collectively at the same solution. The solution was this: do not fight the cold with fire alone. Fight the cold with the earth. Use the fire to charge the earth with heat, and then let the earth release that heat slowly over hours and days in the way that only something with the thermal mass of 6 tons of stone and clay can release it. The system Dmitri built, and the system he drew in careful detail on heavy paper, and the system Vera had watched him build and repair and operate from the time she was old enough to understand what she was seeing, was called a pechka in Russian. The name meant furnace, but the word did not capture what it actually was, which was less a furnace than a conversation between fire and earth conducted through stone and clay and time. The firebox sat in one corner of the structure. From the firebox, instead of a chimney rising straight up and pulling heat out of the building as fast as it produced it, horizontal channels ran through the floor, doubling back on themselves in a pattern that covered as much ground as possible. 43 feet of total channel length embedded in packed clay and river sand and cut straw, creating a mass of stored heat beneath the living surface of the floor that would radiate upward for hours after the fire itself had burned down to coals and gone cold. The smoke and heat traveled through those channels before finally exiting through a vertical shaft that rose only 18 inches above the roofline. The low exit meant the system pulled less hard than a tall chimney, which meant the heat spent more time in the channels and transferred more of itself to the thermal mass before escaping. The buried channels meant the cold of the outside could not reach them. The earth around them was insulation. The earth above the structure was insulation. The entire design worked with the Earth rather than against it, using the properties of mass and patience and slow release that the Earth had in abundance. Dmitri had taught Vera about this system the way he taught her everything, by showing her and then asking her to explain back to him what she had understood, and then correcting the misunderstandings with patience and precision. She had helped him repair the channels when she was 10 years old, fitting stones into the clay with her small hands in places his larger hands could not reach. She had learned the damper system, the clean-out ports, the ratio of firebox size to channel length, the way the draw behaved in different weather conditions. She had not brought his drawings to America because they were a plan she intended to follow. She had brought them because they were the last physical thing he had made with his own hands before he died, because they represented everything he had spent his life learning about how to keep people warm and cold, that wanted to kill them, and because she could not leave that knowledge in Russia when she was going to a place where it might be needed. She chose her building site carefully, a slight elevation above the Tongue River floodplain for drainage, the cottonwoods stand close enough to the north to break the wind, southern exposure for the door to capture the winter sun. She walked the ground for 2 days before she drove her first stake. She spent June and July excavating. The work was the hardest physical labor she had ever done, and she had done a great deal of hard physical labor in her 31 years. She moved dirt with a shovel she had bought on credit from the mercantile in Grafton, piling it in mounds around the perimeter that would later serve as windbreaks. The dugout went down 4 feet into the earth over an area 20 feet long by 14 feet wide. In the heat of July, 4 feet below ground level, the temperature was cool enough that she had to remind herself what she was digging into was protection, not burial. The roof was cottonwood logs she cut from the river stand and hauled to the site in a wagon she borrowed from Conrad, layered with sod she cut in 18-inch squares and stacked with the grass side down. When she finished the roof, she walked away from the structure and turned around and looked at it from 50 yards away, and what she saw was a low mound with a door in it and a stub of stovepipe barely visible above the surface. It looked like the earth had grown a door. It was nearly invisible. Conrad had stopped by when she was laying the roof logs. He had looked at the excavation and at the mounds of piled earth and at the cottonwood logs she was positioning, and he had done the calculation that experienced homesteaders do automatically when they look at a neighbor's construction, the calculation of whether what they are building is going to keep them alive. He had arrived at a number he did not share with her, but the way he stood with his weight shifted to one leg and his arms crossed said clearly enough what the number was. Then she began the interior work. The firebox in the northwest corner, built from river rock she had hauled up from the tongue in borrowed buckets, course by course, mortared with clay she mixed herself. Not large, precisely sized to the channel system that would follow it. A firebox that was too large would push more heat than the channels could absorb efficiently and waste it up the exit pipe. Dmitri had taught her the ratio. She followed it. The channels were the most demanding work. She split the limestone herself, flat slabs that she fitted together in the configuration. Her grandfather's drawings showed the channels running from the firebox through the floor in the pattern that maximized coverage and heat transfer, doubling back 4 times before rising to the exit pipe. 43 feet of channel embedded in a matrix of clay and river sand, mixed with cut straw, building the thermal mass that would store the heat and release it slowly. Cormac Driscoll had stood in her dugout on a hot August afternoon and watched her mortar the last channel stones into place and told her the system would not draw correctly. He told her smoke would back up into the living space and she would suffocate in her sleep and not wake up. And he said it with the specific authority of a man who had seen what cold and smoke did to men who got their heating wrong in railroad camps where there was no one to come looking for you. She had looked up from her work when he finished. In Saratov, she said, my grandfather heat house with one fire. Burn in morning, warm all day, all night. Cormac said this was not Saratov. No, Vera agreed, still not looking up. Is colder. Cormac had stood there for another moment and then walked back up the entry steps and out into the August heat, and Vera had continued mortaring the last of the channel stones into place. She fired the system for the first time on September 3rd, 1874. She built a careful fire from dry cottonwood, small pieces arranged precisely in the firebox, the way Dmitri had taught her, the way that would establish the draw before the full fire was lit. At first the draw was weak. Smoke curled back into the dugout through the firebox opening, and she watched it with the particular attention of someone who has prepared for this moment and knows that what happens in the next 10 minutes will tell her whether her preparation was sound. She adjusted the damper she had fashioned from a sheet of iron, opening it in increments, reading the behavior of the smoke the way her grandfather had taught her to read it, looking for the moment when the draw established itself and the smoke committed to moving through the channels rather than back into the room. The smoke committed. She could feel it more than see it, a shift in the air of the dugout, a pulling sensation that meant the system had found its path and was following it. She fed the fire carefully, adding pieces of a size that would sustain the draw without overwhelming it, building heat into the channel system with the patience that the system required. Within an hour, the earth beneath her feet was warm, not hot, not the concentrated heat of a surface near a flame. A diffuse, pervasive warmth rising through the packed clay floor from the channels beneath the way. Warmth rises from ground that has absorbed a summer day, even and steady and deep. Within 3 hours, the temperature in the dugout was 72 degrees Fahrenheit. She let the fire die to coals. She added no more wood. She sat on the sleeping platform she had built along the east wall, and she felt the temperature of the room, and she listened to the silence, and she thought about her grandfather pressing his hands against the warm floor of his house in Saratov Oblast on winter mornings when the Volga was frozen and the wind was coming off the steppes. And she thought about the look on his face in those moments, not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter than either the look of a man who has worked out an agreement with the physical world and is living inside the terms of that agreement. When she woke the following morning, 10 hours after the last flame had died, the temperature in the dugout was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside it was 49. She sat with that for a moment. 49 outside, 68 inside, with no fire burning and no wood consumed since the previous afternoon. Then she made coffee and went back to work. Oscar Timmerman came by in October. He was a man who respected evidence and who paid attention to things, and he had noticed that Vera's dugout seemed to be functioning better than he had expected it to. He came not to concede anything but to look more closely at what she had built, because Oscar Timmerman had spent 40 years building things, and he was constitutionally incapable of passing by something he did not fully understand without examining it. He stood in the dugout with his hat in his hands and looked at the firebox and the clean-out port she had built into the channel system and the damper arrangement and the low exit pipe, and he explained to her in the careful and slightly elevated tone of a man who does not want to be condescending, but whose knowledge is so much greater than the person he is talking to, that condescension is difficult to entirely avoid what was wrong with the system from a thermodynamic standpoint. Hot air rises, he said. That is not opinion, that is physics. That is a law as fixed as any law God made. You are forcing smoke to travel horizontal through cold earth, losing heat at every bend, fighting the natural direction of convection at every point. A straight chimney draws hard because it works with physics. Your system works against it. He asked her how much wood she had burned since September. 1/4 cord, she said, since September 3rd. Oscar Timmerman had burned through 2 full cords since September. His cabin was not significantly larger than her dugout. He said nothing to this. He put his hat back on and walked back up the entry steps, pausing at the top to look back at the channel system one more time with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit his existing framework and has not yet decided what to do with it. That night Vera sat alone in the dugout with the lamp burning and the channel floor warm beneath her feet and Dimitri's drawings unrolled on the sleeping platform in front of her. She thought about what Oscar Timmerman had said. She thought about it carefully, the way her grandfather had taught her to think about challenges to any system, not with defensiveness, but with honest examination, because a system that cannot survive honest examination is not a system worth defending. Oscar was not wrong about the physics. Hot air did rise. The draw in a tall straight chimney was more powerful than the draw in her horizontal channel system. This was true. What he had not accounted for, what his 40 years of building in Milwaukee had not required him to account for, was what happened to that powerful draw in certain conditions. What happened to a chimney that pulled hard when the wind outside was 50 miles an hour, and the temperature was 40 below, and the pressure differential created by that combination turned a chimney into something that worked against the building it was supposed to serve. But she did not know this yet. She suspected it in the way that someone who has been taught a system understands not just what the system does, but why it was designed the way it was designed. The accumulated wisdom of the design visible to someone who knows how to look for it. She suspected that her grandfather's horizontal channels were not a failure of understanding, but a deliberate response to conditions that Oscar Timmerman had never built for. But suspicion was not certainty. And alone in the dugout that October evening, for the first time since she had begun building, she felt the weight of the uncertainty. She picked up the tarnished icon from the shelf where she kept it and held it in her hands. Saint Seraphim, who had lived alone in the Russian forest for 30 years, and who had survived conditions that would have killed most men who had understood something about patience and endurance, and the specific kind of faith that is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to continue in the presence of it. She sat with the uncertainty for a long time. Then she set the icon back on its shelf. She rolled Dimitri's drawings up carefully and put them back in the leather satchel with Pavel's naturalization papers. She fed a small fire into the firebox, just enough to recharge the thermal mass for the night. And she lay down on the sleeping platform and closed her eyes and felt the warmth of her grandfather's knowledge rising through the Dakota earth beneath her, and she slept. The first winter passed. It was hard as all winters in Pembina County were hard, but it was not the killing winter. The temperature dropped to 38 below in January and stayed there for 11 days, and Conrad Halverson burned through his entire season's wood supply by February and had to burn furniture to keep his children alive, which was exactly what had happened the first winter he had spent in Pembina County. and which had not apparently changed his convictions about the correct way to build a heating system. Vera burned through 1.5 cords for the entire winter. She did not make a point of this. She did not go to Conrad's cabin and present him with the comparison. She went about her work, which in the spring of 1875 meant breaking ground on 12 acres of the black loam she had filed on planting a garden, cutting hay, doing everything required to prove up her homestead claim and survive another year on the northern plains of Dakota Territory. The second summer she was there, 1875, she expanded the dugout's channel system, adding a branch that ran beneath the sleeping area for additional warmth. She sourced better limestone from a deposit she found along the river and replaced 2 sections of the channel that had developed small cracks in the freeze and thaw of the first winter. She built a proper entry tunnel, 4 steps descending from the outside door to the main room, that created an airlock against the wind and captured what little solar heat a south-facing entry could collect in winter. Conrad watched these improvements from across the fence line with the expression of a man who has said what he has to say and is not going to repeat himself, but who is keeping careful note of evidence for future reference. Ingrid Halverson came to help Vera cut and preserve vegetables in August of 1875. They worked together for a full day in companionable near silence. 2 women who did not share a language well enough for conversation, but who shared enough of the fundamental vocabulary of frontier domestic work to accomplish the task efficiently. When Ingrid left, she paused at the top of the entry steps and looked back at the interior of the dugout with a look that was different from the look she had given it the year before. Less sorrow in it, and more of something else, something that might have been a recognition she was not ready yet to put into words. On the morning of January 9th, 1876, Vera Strelkov woke before dawn and went outside and stood in the cold of a Dakota January morning and looked at the sky. What she saw made her go back inside and begin preparing. She spent the entire day of January 9th hauling water from the spring and filling every vessel she owned, including 2 wooden barrels she bought on credit from Cormac Driscoll, who sold them to her without asking why she needed them, because on the frontier you did not ask such questions if you did not want to answer them yourself. She brought in firewood, stacking it in the entry tunnel until the passage was barely wide enough to navigate. She checked her food stores, the 43 pounds of potatoes in the storage pit she had dug beneath the northeast corner, the salt pork hanging from the roof beams, the cornmeal and dried beans, and the small wheel of cheese she had traded labor for at the Halverson place. Conrad saw her preparations from across the fence line. "It's just winter," he called. "You act like the world's ending." She did not respond. She carried another armload of firewood into the entry tunnel and went back for more. The barometer in Cormac Driscoll's cabin had been falling for 18 hours when the temperature began its serious drop on the afternoon of January 11th. It went from 18 below to 26 below between noon and sunset, a rate of change that was not normal and not good, and that Cormac noted in the small journal he kept, because 30 years of living in hard places had taught him the value of having a record of what the hard places did. By midnight the temperature was 34 below. The wind arrived at 2 in the morning on January 12th. It came from the northwest, from Canada, from the vast flat, nothing between Pembina County, Dakota Territory, and the Arctic Circle, and it came with a sound that people who heard it and survived it would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who had not. It was not the sound of wind. Wind makes a sound you can locate a direction, a pitch that changes as it moves. This was something different. This was the sound of the atmosphere itself moving, of a pressure system the size of a continent pushing south, with the indifference of something that has no awareness of the things in its path. The temperature dropped to 43 below within the first hour. In her dugout 4 feet below the surface of the Dakota plain, with 6 tons of warm thermal mass beneath her floor, and 2 feet of sod above her head, and the entry tunnel packed with firewood and sealed against the wind by the physics of its own design. Vera Strelkov lit her morning fire. She built it small and careful the way Dmitri had taught her. Outside the wind hit 57 miles per hour before dawn and did not slow down. The wind did not stop. This was the thing that separated this storm from the storms that Conrad Halvorsen and Oscar Timmerman and Cormac Driscoll had survived before, the storms that had shaped their understanding of what winter on the northern plains could do. Those storms had come and tested and passed. They had duration measured in hours, or at most a day and a night, and the men who lived through them had come out the other side with cold fingers and depleted woodpiles, and the particular satisfaction of having been tested and found adequate. This storm had no interest in passing. It settled over Pembina County like something that had arrived with intention, like weather that had made a decision, and the decision was to remain. The temperature on the morning of January 12th was 43 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the wind was moving at 57 miles per hour. And the combination of those two facts created a condition on the open prairie of Dakota Territory that went beyond cold into something that did not have a comfortable name in English, something the Lakota had understood for generations and described in their language as Wanatu Watakia, the winter that takes everything. Conrad Halvorsen understood within the first hour that this was different. He had been awake since 1 in the morning, lying in the dark of his cabin, listening to the wind build from the northwest with the attention of a man who has learned to read weather the way a sailor reads water, not from books but from the body of experience that comes from living in a place long enough that the place begins to teach you its own language. What he heard building outside his walls in the hour before dawn did not sound like the storms he had survived. It sounded like something he had not encountered before, something that fell outside the categories his experience had given him. When the wind hit the cabin at full force, the first thing that failed was the chimney. Conrad's chimney was straight and true, built from good stone with proper mortar, rising from the firebox through the cabin roof to a height that any experienced builder would have called adequate for the purpose. It had drawn cleanly through 2 winters of normal Dakota cold. It had performed exactly as chimneys were supposed to perform, pulling smoke upward and out and away from the people living beneath it, maintaining a steady draw that kept the fire burning hot and the cabin warm. In the first minutes of the full storm, the wind found the chimney opening. What happened was a function of physics that Oscar Timmerman could have explained precisely if he had been thinking about it from the right direction, which was not the direction his 40 years of Milwaukee building had trained him to think. A chimney draws because the air inside it is warmer and therefore lighter than the air outside, and the pressure differential that creates pulls air up through the firebox and out the top. This works reliably under normal conditions. Under the condition of a 57-mile-per-hour wind hitting a chimney opening directly, the physics reverses. The wind creates a pressure at the chimney top that is greater than the pressure the warm interior air can maintain against it, and the column of air in the chimney that should be rising finds itself pushed downward instead, carrying with it smoke and ash, and the cold of the outside pouring it back into the living space. Conrad smelled the smoke before he fully understood what was happening. Then he saw it, the gray haze filling the upper portion of the cabin. The fire in the firebox guttering and struggling against the reverse draw. The temperature of the room already beginning to fall as the cold air pushing down the chimney displaced the warm air his fire had spent hours producing. He had two choices. He could keep the fire burning and accept the smoke which would drive his family out or suffocate them in their sleep. Or he could close the damper, cutting off the oxygen to the fire, and let it die. He closed the damper. The fire died within 20 minutes. Without the fire, the temperature inside the cabin began to fall at a rate that Conrad measured against his body, rather than any instrument, the particular progression of cold through a closed space that he had felt before in smaller ways, but never at this speed, and never from a starting point of 43 below outside. In the first hour after the fire died, the temperature in the cabin dropped 14 degrees Fahrenheit. He counted his firewood. He looked at the damper. He tried reopening it slightly, hoping the angle of the wind had shifted enough to allow a cautious draw. Smoke poured back into the room within seconds. He closed it again. Ingrid wrapped the children in every blanket and piece of clothing they owned and put them together in the corner farthest from the outside walls. She did not say anything to Conrad about any of this. She moved with the efficient calm of a woman who understood the situation completely and had decided that panic was a luxury the situation did not permit. Conrad sat in the cooling cabin and thought about the 11 cords of firewood stacked against his south wall that he could not use because using them required a chimney, and his chimney had become a liability rather than an asset in the first hour of the storm. 300 yards to the south, the low mound near the Tongue River bend produced no visible smoke and made no visible accommodation for the storm at all. The wind that was pushing itself down Conrad's chimney and reversing the physics of his heating system could not push itself down Vera Strelkov's exit pipe because the pipe rose only 18 inches above the roof line, and because the drifting snow had already half buried it, leaving a small opening that drew just enough air to keep the coals in the firebox alive, without creating the pressure differential that would allow the wind to reverse the flow. The horizontal channels beneath her floor were not affected by what the wind was doing to the atmosphere above them. They were 4 feet underground. The wind did not reach them. The thermal mass they had been charging since the previous morning continued to release its stored heat upward through the packed clay floor, with the same steady patience it had been demonstrating since September of 1874. The storm that was dismantling the heating system Conrad had spent 3 years relying on had no mechanism to reach the heating system Vera had spent a year building. She was burning approximately 1/16 of a cord per day. Conrad, when his chimney worked, burned approximately 2 cords per day in storm conditions. He had 11 cords. At normal consumption, he could sustain heat through 5.5 days of the kind of burning the storm required. But his chimney was not working. The fire he could not sustain was not consuming his wood at 2 cords per day. It was consuming nothing because it was not burning, because the smoke it produced was going into the room where his family was trying to stay alive. He had 11 cords of firewood he could not use. Across the prairie, the other homesteaders were encountering variations of the same problem from different directions. Oscar Timmerman's setup was the most sophisticated in the settlement by conventional measures. He had a German heating stove with a water jacket and circulating pipes, the product of genuine engineering knowledge applied to the specific problem of keeping a large space warm with maximum efficiency. Under normal conditions, it was the best heating system in Pembina County, better than Conrad's open firebox, better than Cormac Driscoll's simple iron stove. Oscar had built it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, and he was proud of it in the restrained way that competent craftsmen are proud of competent work. Under the conditions of January 12, 1876, Oscar's sophisticated stove had the same chimney problem that Conrad's simple firebox had, plus an additional problem that the sophistication of his system created. The water jacket and the circulating pipes required sustained combustion to function. When the wind pressure at the chimney top interfered with the draw, the fire in Oscar's stove burned less cleanly, producing more smoke and less heat. He could not simply close the damper the way Conrad had, because his system's pressure dynamics were more complex, and the consequences of mismanaging them more dangerous. What he could do was burn more wood. He fed the fire at a rate that overcame the reverse draw through sheer heat output, maintaining enough upward pressure in the chimney to keep the smoke moving in the right direction. This worked. The stove performed. The cabin stayed warm. But the rate of wood consumption required to maintain this condition was 3 times the normal rate, which meant he was burning through his winter supply at a pace that would exhaust it in a fraction of the time he had provisioned for. By the end of the first day, Oscar had burned through more than half a cord. He burned 1 full cord every 18 hours of the storm's first day, and the cabin temperature he achieved with this consumption was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which was survivable but not comfortable, and which represented a conversion of potential energy into actual warmth so inefficient that Oscar, who had spent his professional life thinking about efficiency, found it genuinely painful to contemplate. Cormac Driscoll fared slightly differently. His cabin was smaller than the others, more tightly chinked, and he had built it partially into a south-facing slope, in the way that railroad workers learned to build temporary shelters, using the earth to moderate the cold, where vertical walls were vulnerable to wind. This gave him some natural insulation that the fully above-ground structures lacked. His chimney suffered the same wind-induced draw problems as the others, but his smaller space required less heat to maintain a survivable temperature, and his years in railroad camps had given him a practical relationship with desperate cold that the homesteaders who had come west from civilian life did not quite have. He burned his wood at 3 times the normal rate to keep his fire fighting the reverse draw. He burned his kitchen table on the second day. He burned 2 chairs. He made the arithmetic calculation that Oscar had made, and that Conrad had made, and that every person in Pembina County was making in their heads during those first hours of the storm, the calculation of wood supply divided by consumption rate, and he arrived at a number that was not large enough. Have you ever sat in a room with a problem that has no good solution and done the same arithmetic over and over again? Not because you expect a different answer, but because the act of calculating feels more like control than sitting with your hands in your lap. That is what the men and women of Pembina County were doing in their cabins while the wind moved at 57 miles per hour outside and the temperature held at 43 below, and the storm showed no sign of ending. They were doing arithmetic they already knew the answer to, because the arithmetic was the only thing they could do. Inside the dugout, Vera was reading, She had a Bible printed in German that Reverend Aldgate had loaned her when he realized she could not read his English one, and she was reading it in the lamplight with the lamp turned low to conserve oil, sitting on the sleeping platform, with a blanket across her legs, not because she was cold, but because she was comfortable, and a blanket across the legs while reading was comfortable. The thermometer on the shelf read 71 degrees Fahrenheit. She had lit her morning fire at dawn, a careful arrangement of dry cottonwood in the firebox, sized to what the channel system needed to recharge after the night rather than to what the room needed to heat. The room needed nothing from the fire directly. The room was being heated by the earth beneath it. She fired for the channels. She fired for the thermal mass. When the channels were charged, she let the fire die back to coals, and the coals would sustain themselves through the day on the wood she had already given them. She could not hear the wind clearly through 4 feet of earth and 2 feet of sod. She could hear it as a low sustained pressure, a sound more felt than heard, a vibration that the structure transmitted in a muted way that communicated the fact of the storm without communicating its full violence. Above her the wind was moving at 57 miles per hour, and had been for 12 hours. She knew this because she had seen the clouds and the pressure and the behavior of the animals the morning before, and she had done the arithmetic of those signs in a different way than her neighbors were doing their wood arithmetic. She had arrived at a number that said this storm would last 4 days. She turned a page. The second day of the storm was worse than the first, in the way that sustained cold is worse than initial cold, not because the temperature dropped further, though it did, but because the cold that had already penetrated everything began to find the places that the first day's cold had not yet reached. The gaps in log walls that had seemed adequately chinked proved to have limits. The cold that had been held at the surface of the walls began to penetrate into the wall mass itself, reducing the insulating effect that the wall had provided on day 1. Children who had been warm enough under their blankets on the first night were less warm on the second night because the blankets themselves had absorbed some of the cold coming through the walls. Conrad Halverson's cabin temperature in the hours when he could sustain a fire against the reverse draw cycled between survivable and frightening. In the hours when the wind pushed down the chimney hard enough that he had to close the damper and let the fire die, the temperature fell toward the point where water froze in a cup on a table in a closed room, which is not a point that a family with children can permit for long. He had not slept since the storm began. He sat in the darkest cold of the second night, and he thought about the Russian woman in the mound of earth 300 yards to the south, the woman who had arrived 18 months ago with drawings that the land office clerk had laughed at, the woman he had told on the second day of her arrival that she would never survive a winter alone, the woman whose preparation he had watched through the fence line with the combination of skepticism and grudging respect that one hard-working person feels toward another. Hard-working person whose work appears to be proceeding in the wrong direction. He thought about Ingrid bringing her bread in May of 1874. He thought about the look on Ingrid's face when she came back from that visit. He thought about Ingrid standing in the doorway of the dugout in August of 1875, looking at the interior with an expression he had catalogued at the time as simple curiosity, and that he was now reassessing as something more. He did not think yet about whether Vera Strelkov was warm. He was not ready to think about that yet. On the morning of the third day, Oscar Timmerman's firewood supply had fallen to a level that he could calculate precisely would not last another 48 hours, if he maintained the consumption rate the storm required. He was a man who dealt in facts, and this was a fact. He sat with it, the way he sat with any structural problem, turning it over and looking at it from every angle, and every angle he could find produced the same result. His sophisticated heating system, the one he had been genuinely proud of, the one he had explained to Vera Strelkov the previous October in terms of thermodynamic principles that he had not doubted as he stated them, was consuming wood at a rate that would leave his family without heat before the storm ended. The efficiency he had built into the system under normal operating conditions had become irrelevant in conditions the system had not been designed for. He had not been designed for these conditions either. The 40 years of Milwaukee building that he had brought west with him had given him a framework for thinking about heating that assumed certain things about how chimneys behaved and how weather behaved and what the limits of winter in a cold climate looked like. Those assumptions had been adequate for Milwaukee in December and January. They had been adequate for Pembina County in the first 2 winters he had spent here. They were not adequate for what was outside his walls on the morning of the 3rd day of January 1876. He started burning green wood he had meant to season for next year. It burned poorly, filling his cabin with smoke that he had to manage, carefully producing less heat per cord than dry seasoned wood, and requiring more of it to sustain the temperature he was trying to maintain. He added the smoke management problem to the firewood problem, and he sat with both of them together, and he did the arithmetic that produced the number he did not want. Cormac Driscoll had burned his kitchen table and 2 chairs by the morning of the 3rd day. He had calculated his remaining wood supply at approximately 60 hours of burning at his current rate. The storm, if it held to anything like a normal pattern, should break within that window. He was going to make it probably if the storm ended when storms of this kind typically ended. He did not know that this storm was not ending when storms of this kind typically ended. Nobody in Pembina County knew this except Vera Strelkov, who had read the sky on the morning of January 9th and done the arithmetic of what she saw and arrived at a number that said 4 days, and who had spent the day of January 9th preparing for 4 days because that was the number the sky had given her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Conrad Halverson made a decision. His wood supply was not exhausted, but it was close enough to exhaustion that the arithmetic of the remaining days was not comfortable. More immediately, his family had been managing cold for 2 days, in conditions that were taking a visible toll, particularly on the 2 youngest children, who had been running fevers that Ingrid was treating with the limited resources available to a homestead family on the northern plains in January of 1876. He needed wood. Oscar Timmerman's claim was 170 yards to the east. 170 yards in clear summer weather was a 3-minute walk. In the conditions outside his door on the afternoon of January 15, 1876, it was something else entirely. Conrad was not a man who did things without thought. He had not survived what he had survived by being impulsive. He sat with the problem for a long time before he stood up and went to the peg by the door and took down the coil of rope he kept there. He tied one end around his waist. He tested the knot 3 times. He tied the other end to the interior door handle with a knot that would hold his weight if it needed to. He put on everything he owned that could be layered. He stood at the door for a moment, and he thought about the distance 170 yards, and about the wind 57 miles per hour from the northwest, and about the temperature 43 degrees below zero, and he made the calculation that a man makes when his options have narrowed to something and nothing. He opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical object, not like weather, but like a wall that was also moving a surface of force that knocked him sideways immediately and filled every space between his clothes and his skin with cold before he had taken his second step. He could not see. The snow that the wind was carrying moved horizontally, not falling but flying, driven with enough force that it struck the exposed skin of his face like fine gravel, and in the seconds before his eyes instinctively closed, he could see nothing beyond a white blank that offered no reference point, no horizon, no landmark, nothing by which a man could orient himself in the space between where he was and where he meant to go. He walked. He counted steps because counting was the only navigation available to him. He leaned into the wind at the angle that kept him on his feet, and he counted steps, and he told himself that 170 yards was approximately 240 steps at his stride length, and that he was going to count to 240, and at the end of that count he was going to be at Oscar Timmerman's door. He reached the count of 63 before he understood that he had lost the direction. Not gradually. It happened in the space of 2 or 3 steps, a failure of orientation so complete that he could not have said with any confidence which direction he was facing. The wind came from everywhere in that condition, or rather the wind came from the northwest, but the northwest was a concept that required a reference point to be useful, and he had no reference point. He had white, he had cold, he had the rope around his waist and the other end of the rope tied to the handle of his cabin door, and that was everything he had. He stood still for a moment. This was the decision that saved him. The decision to stop moving when he could not see, because movement in whiteout conditions without a reference point was as likely to take him away from safety as toward it, and was more likely to exhaust him in the time it took to do that. He pulled the rope. It was still taut. The other end was still anchored. He followed it back, hand over hand, through the white and the cold and the wind that had no direction, because it was every direction, and he moved along the rope the way a blind man moves along a railing, with complete faith in the fixed point at the other end, because faith in the fixed point was the only navigation he had. He reached the door. He was inside for several seconds before he could open his eyes fully enough to see. The wind had driven particles of ice into the skin of his face with enough force to raise welts along both cheekbones and the bridge of his nose, and the skin was bleeding in 2 places where the ice had cut rather than bruised. He could not feel his fingers. He looked at them when he was inside, and they were white to the second knuckle on both hands, the white of tissue that has lost its circulation, the white that precedes the darkness that precedes the loss of the tissue entirely. Ingrid saw his hands before she saw his face. She made a sound that was not quite a word. The sound a person makes when the thing they have been keeping at the edge of their awareness steps fully into the center of it. She took his hands between hers and began the careful work of warming them, not with heat which damages tissue that has been that cold, but with the moderate warmth of her own hands, and her own body working slowly and patiently while Conrad sat in the chair by the dead firebox and did not speak. The children watched from their corner. He had gone 63 steps. He had been trying to go 240. He had gone approximately 1/4 of the way to Oscar Timmerman's door, and he had lost the direction, and he had come back. 107 yards from where he had been trying to go, in conditions where finding those 107 yards again was not something the rope around his waist could help him do. He sat in the chair for a long time after Ingrid had done what she could for his hands. He was thinking about many things. He was thinking about his children, and about Ingrid, and about the firewood that was not going to last as long as the storm. He was thinking about Oscar, who was 170 yards to the east, and who was burning green wood. He was thinking about Cormac Driscoll, who had burned his kitchen table, and about Reverend Aldgate, whom nobody had checked on since the storm began. But underneath those thoughts running beneath them, the way heat runs beneath packed clay, was a thought about the low mound 300 yards to the south, the one that had not shown smoke for 3 days, the one he had told Ingrid belonged to a dead woman. He was not ready to examine that thought directly. He sat with it the way a man sits with something painful, aware of it without looking at it, allowing it to exist without yet requiring it to be fully articulated. The fourth day began without announcement. The darkness before dawn of January 15th looked and sounded exactly like the darkness before dawn of the 3 days before it. The same sustained pressure of wind, the same cold that had settled into the settlement as thoroughly as if it intended to stay permanently, the same white nothing beyond every window. And then in the middle of the morning the wind stopped. Not gradually. This is the thing about certain storms on the northern plains. They do not taper and diminish the way coastal storms diminish. They stop. The pressure system moves or collapses or exhausts itself, and the wind that has been screaming for 76 consecutive hours simply ceases, and the silence that follows is so complete and so sudden that the people who have been living inside the noise of the storm for 3 days and nights find themselves in a different kind of disorientation. The disorientation of a world gone quiet so abruptly that the quiet itself feels wrong. Thomas McKenna had written in his journal in a railroad camp in Minnesota years before about the silence after a blizzard that it sounded like the world holding its breath, like something enormous deciding whether to continue. The people of Pembina County heard that silence on the morning of January 15th and understood it in their bodies before they understood it in their minds. The temperature remained at 37 degrees below zero. There was no warmth in the stopping of the wind, but without the wind, the cold became navigable in a way that it had not been for 4 days. Without the wind, a man could walk from his door to his neighbor's door. Without the wind, a rope around a waist was navigation enough. Conrad Halverson emerged from his cabin into the silence at mid-morning. The landscape had been remade. Snow had drifted to the eaves of his south wall, the wall where his 11 cords of firewood were stacked, and those drifts had partly buried the wood under a depth that would take hours to excavate. The trail that normally connected his property to Oscar's to the east was completely unmarked, no visible path in either direction, nothing but white in every direction to the horizon. He looked south. The low mound by the Tongue River bend was visible barely as a slight irregularity in the flat white of the prairie, a gentle rise that was almost indistinguishable from the drifts that had accumulated everywhere around it. The stovepipe was buried to its opening. There was no smoke. There had been no smoke for 4 days. He organized the men who were ambulatory. Oscar, whose hands and feet were sound despite his exhausted wood supply. Cormac Driscoll, who was moving carefully because of his feet, but who was moving. Reverend Aldgate, who had spent the storm in a root cellar he had dug the previous summer and who had come through it cold and frightened but intact. 3 other men from claims along the river bottom, who had survived in various states of depleted resource and diminished certainty. 6 men walked south across the snow. Conrad was in front. He did not speak as they walked. He was thinking about what he had told Ingrid 3 days ago about spring coming and burial arrangements, and the particular sadness of someone who had tried something unreasonable and paid the price that unreasonable things extracted. He was thinking about those words, and about the 63 steps he had taken in the whiteout, and about the rope that had brought him back, and about the specific failure of certainty that 63 steps had represented. He walked and he thought, and he did not say any of this to the men behind him. They reached the door of the dugout. It was marked by a drift that had accumulated against the south face, a drift that required a minute of clearing before the door itself was visible and accessible. Conrad cleared the drift with his hands, not having brought a shovel, working with the urgency of a man who is not sure what he is going to find on the other side of the door he is uncovering. He knocked. The silence after the knock lasted long enough that the thought he had been not examining for 3 days stepped fully into the center of his awareness, stepped into it and stood there with all its weight. The thought about the low mound and the absent smoke and the woman he had told Ingrid was dead. Then he heard movement on the other side of the door. The door opened, the heat came out first. Out. It came out as a wave, a rolling displacement of warm air into the cold of the January morning that was so immediate and so complete that it stopped all 6 men, simultaneously stopped them, not because they decided to stop, but because their bodies stopped them, because the heat hit their faces and their hands and their cold damaged extremities, and their bodies made an involuntary response to it that precedes any conscious decision. Vera Strelkov stood in the doorway in her shirt sleeves. No shawl, no extra layers, no indication on her person of the experience of the last 4 days beyond a mild curiosity at the sight of 6 men standing at her door in 37 below cold. She looked at them. She looked at Conrad's face, and at his hands, and at the faces of the men behind him. "Are you all right?" she said. "Do you need help?" The thermometer on the shelf behind her read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The 6 men stood in the cold of the Dakota morning and processed what they were looking at. The silence that followed lasted longer than silences usually last between people who have something to say to each other. 6 men stood in 37 degrees below zero cold on the Dakota prairie, and the heat from the open door moved against their faces in a way that none of them had felt in 4 days. And the woman standing in the doorway in her shirt sleeves looked at them with genuine concern for their condition, which was the concern of someone who has been comfortable for 4 days and is looking at people who have not been. Conrad Halverson spoke first. He said, "We came to see if you were alive." Vera Strelkov looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she stepped back from the doorway and held the door open wider and said, "Come in, is warm." They came in one at a time, ducking through the entry and descending the 4 steps into the main room, and each man, as he descended, felt the temperature change around him, the way you feel a river when you wade into it, not gradually, but as a threshold crossed a clear distinction between the world above and the world below. The air in the dugout was not the moderate warmth of a space barely maintained against the cold. It was room temperature. It was the temperature of a space that had been inhabited comfortably by a person going about normal life. Oscar Timmerman was the last man through the door. He stood at the bottom of the entry steps and looked at the interior with the specific attention of a man whose professional life had been spent understanding how spaces worked and why they worked, and what made the difference between a structure that did what it was supposed to do and a structure that failed to do it. He had been in this dugout before. He had stood here in October and explained thermodynamic principles to the woman who built it. He had been right about the principles. He was standing in the evidence that he had been wrong about what the principles meant. The thermometer on the shelf read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at it for a long time. Vera brought water from the barrel near the door, water that was liquid rather than frozen because 4 feet of earth insulated the barrel from the temperature above, and she gave it to the men who needed it, which was all of them. And she looked at Conrad's hands with the practical eye of someone who has spent time in cold places and knows what damaged hands look like, and she asked him without ceremony how long they had been that color. Conrad told her about the rope. He told her about the 63 steps and the whiteout and the moment when the direction had simply ceased to be a concept available to him. He told it without self-pity as a sequence of events that had occurred and that had produced the hands she was looking at, because that was the way Conrad Halverson told things. Vera listened without interrupting. When he finished, she went to the storage area under the sleeping platform and took out a cloth and a small tin of tallow, and she worked on his hands with the same focused patience she brought to every physical problem. The patience of someone who has learned that most problems yield to careful, sustained attention rather than to force. Cormac Driscoll sat on the bench near the firebox and looked at the floor. He knew the floor was warm because he had been cold for 4 days, and he could feel the warmth of it rising through the soles of his boots. A diffuse, gentle warmth that was nothing like the heat of a surface near a flame, and everything like the warmth of ground that has absorbed heat deeply and is releasing it back slowly. He had 3 toes on his left foot that he could not feel. He had been trying not to think about those toes since the second day of the storm, when the numbness had stopped being a temporary condition and had started being a permanent one. He said in Russia, your grandfather heat whole house with one fire. Vera looked up from Conrad's hands. Yes, she said. Cormac said works very well then. That design. It really works. Vera said works very well. Then she went back to Conrad's hands. Oscar Timmerman had moved to the southeast corner of the room where the channel system was most accessible for examination. He was crouching near the floor, pressing his palm flat against the packed clay surface and holding it there with the attention of a man taking a measurement. The warmth he felt through his palm was steady and even and pervasive, not the localized heat of a surface near a heat source, but something distributed through the material itself released uniformly from below. He had brought a small journal with him in his coat pocket, the habit of a professional man who never went anywhere without the means to record what he observed. He took it out and opened it and looked at it for a moment without writing anything. Then he put it back. He said, you burned how much wood total during the 4 days? Vera told him. She had burned just under 3/4 of a cord across the entire storm, firing each morning for the channels and letting the fire die back to coals by midday, recharging the thermal mass once a day, rather than maintaining a continuous fire. Oscar sat with this number. He had burned more than 3 cords in the same 4 days, and he had achieved a cabin temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit at his best moments, and he had exhausted his winter supply and started on green wood that burned poorly and filled his space with smoke. Vera had burned 3/4 of a cord and maintained 68 degrees throughout. He took the journal back out. He began writing. This was Oscar Timmerman, processing information the way he had always processed information, through the discipline of recording it precisely, because recording it precisely was the first step toward understanding it correctly. He wrote the wood consumption figures. He wrote the temperature differential. He began sketching the channel system as he understood it from his previous visit and from what he could see of it now, asking Vera occasional questions when his sketch required clarification. She answered each question fully and without withholding, the way Dmitri had always answered her questions when she was learning, because information that is hoarded protects only the person holding it, and information that is shared protects everyone who receives it. Conrad Halverson watched Oscar writing in the corner. He watched it with the particular attention of a man who is thinking about something adjacent to what he is looking at. He was thinking about October, when Oscar had stood in this dugout and explained why the system was thermodynamically inefficient. He was thinking about the specific confidence with which that explanation had been delivered, the confidence of a man who had built 17 houses and understood how heat moved, and was applying that understanding correctly to the problem at hand. He had agreed with Oscar's analysis in October. It had seemed correct to him in October. He looked at his hands. The color was returning slowly to the upper knuckles. He looked at the thermometer on the shelf. 68 degrees, outside the door 37 below. He did not have the engineering vocabulary that Oscar had. He could not have written down what was wrong with his analysis in October in the precise terms that Oscar was working toward in his journal, but he understood what he was looking at. A man understands certain things not through language, but through the accumulated experience of living through the way the body processes information that the mind is still formulating, and what Conrad Halverson's body was telling him as he stood in 68-degree warmth in the dugout of the woman he had told his wife was probably dead, was something that did not require technical vocabulary to be completely clear. He had been wrong about this from the beginning, not just about the storm, about all of it, about the drawings the land office clerk had laughed at, about the system that Oscar had explained the thermodynamics of, about the woman who had arrived with broken English and 3 possessions, and filed on a quarter section of River Bend ground, and built something that none of the experienced men around her had understood well enough to build themselves. He stood with this for a while without saying anything. The men spent most of the morning in the dugout. Vera fed them what she had, which was potatoes and salt pork and coffee, real coffee that she had rationed carefully through the winter, and that she now made without rationing because there were 6 cold men in her home, and coffee was what the situation required. They ate and they warmed and they talked about the storm and about what the settlement was going to need in the days immediately ahead. Who was in the most difficult situation, what resources could be shared across claims, what the priorities were for the first clear days before the next weather came. This was the conversation that people on the frontier had after hard things, the practical, forward-looking conversation that replaced the examination of what had gone wrong with the planning of what needed to happen next, because what needed to happen next was always more urgent than the accounting of the past. Reverend Aldgate sat near the firebox and looked at the channel system and said nothing for a long time. He had worried about fire, about sparks escaping through the stone channels and catching in the earth, about invisible combustion moving through the clay and emerging somewhere unexpected. He had said this to Vera more than once in the months before the storm. Now he looked at a system that had operated continuously for a year and a half without incident, and he thought about the specific nature of his worry and about the specific nature of what had actually happened, and he thought about the difference between the thing you fear and the thing that actually arrives. He said, "I think I owe you an acknowledgement." Vera looked at him. He said I worried about the wrong thing. She poured him more coffee. He said I will write to my colleagues in Wisconsin about this system. I will send them drawings if you will allow me to copy yours. There are families in Wisconsin who heat their homes with fireplaces that work the same way Conrad's chimney worked in this storm, and they do not know there is another way. Vera told him she would let him copy the drawings. She told him what measurements were critical and which ones could be adjusted for different footprint sizes, and what the ratio of firebox to channel length needed to be maintained regardless of how other dimensions changed. She told him what she had learned in a year and a half of operating the system, the things that Dimitri's drawings had shown her, and the things that operating the drawings had taught her that the drawings themselves could not show. Aldgate wrote everything down. In the days that followed, as the settlement dug itself out and assessed its condition and began the work of getting through the remaining weeks of a winter that had not finished with them, Vera found herself in the center of a conversation she had not expected and had not asked for. The conversation had been started by what 6 men had seen when the door of her dugout opened on the morning of January 15th. And the heat came out and she stood there in her shirt sleeves. That moment had traveled through Pembina County the way moments travel in small communities where everyone knows everyone, and the events of one household are the business of all households, not through malice or gossip, but through the fundamental human need to share experiences that challenge the framework through which experience is understood. They found her alive, the story went. They found her alive and warm. 68 degrees in the middle of 4 days at 43 below, people came to see. Not all of them. Some of the homesteaders in Pembina County in the winter of 1876 were too depleted by the storm and its aftermath to travel, and some of them were too proud, and some of them were the kind of people who need a longer interval between their certainty and the evidence against it before they can make the journey from one to the other. But some of them came, and they came in ones and twos over the course of February and March, riding out to the River Bend claim on days when the weather permitted riding, and they went down the 4 steps into the main room, and they put their hands on the floor, and they felt what Vera had felt on the evening of September 3rd, 1874, the warmth that came from the earth rather than from the air, the steady, patient release of stored heat that was nothing like the heat of a surface near a flame, and everything like the heat of a place that understood what cold actually required. Oscar Timmerman came back in February. He came alone without the other men on a morning when the temperature was only 12 below and the sky was clear. He tied his horse at the cottonwood stand and knocked at the door, and when Vera let him in, he sat down at the small table she had built into the east wall, and he opened his journal to the pages he had been filling since January 15th, and he put the journal on the table between them. He had been calculating. He had been calculating since the morning after the storm ended, filling pages with figures and diagrams and the specific kind of thinking that happens when a man who has spent his life believing one thing is confronted with precise evidence that the thing he believed was not wrong exactly, but incomplete, not false, but limited in ways he had not understood the limits of. He had calculated the efficiency of Vera's system against the efficiency of his own stove, and the number he had arrived at was 340%. Her system converted approximately 78% of the wood's potential energy into useful heat retained in the structure. His stove under normal conditions converted approximately 45%, and under the wind conditions of the January storm, it had converted something closer to 20%, as the chimney effect worked against the heating rather than for it. 340% more efficient, not in some marginal way that could be attributed to measurement variation or different living patterns, in a way that was visible in the woodpile and in the thermometer and in the fundamental physics of what each system did to the heat it generated. He sat across from Vera and looked at his figures and then looked at her. He said, I need every measurement of those channels, every single one. Vera brought out Dimitri's drawings. They spent 3 hours at the table, Oscar asking questions, and Vera answering them. Oscar translating the answers into the technical language he used for building specifications. Vera correcting him when his translation lost something important from the original. The firebox dimensions, the channel cross-section, the ratio of thermal mass to living space, the draft requirements at different temperature differentials, the clean-out port placement and the cleaning procedure, the damper design and the way the damper needed to be adjusted through the seasons as the thermal mass accumulated or released its stored heat. Oscar filled 11 pages. When they were done, he sat back and looked at what he had written, and then looked at the floor beneath his feet, and then looked at Vera. He had built 17 houses in Milwaukee, and he had spent his professional life learning how buildings worked, and he was sitting across from a 32-year-old Russian woman who had built something that 340% of his knowledge had told him was thermodynamically inferior, and the evidence of the last 4 days and the 11 pages in his journal told him something specific about the relationship between knowledge and experience, and the difference between understanding the principles and understanding what the principles meant in conditions you had not yet encountered. He said, I will rebuild the mill structure with a channel system under the floor, and the house, both of them. He held out his hand. Vera shook it. He said, I told you in October that your system fought against physics. She said nothing. He said what I did not understand was which physics I was talking about. Mine worked in Milwaukee. Yours works here. He picked up his journal and his coat, and he walked up the 4 steps and out into the February cold, and she heard his horse moving away through the crusted snow toward the east. She sat at the table for a moment after he left. She thought about October, the specific evening of Oscar's visit, the lamp burning and the floor warm beneath her feet, and the icon on the shelf, and Dimitri's drawings open in front of her, and the weight of the uncertainty that his thermodynamic argument had placed on her for that one night before she had fired the system and felt the floor warm under her in the morning and slept. She thought about Dmitri, who had built his system in Saratov Oblast, without the vocabulary of thermodynamic efficiency, who had not known the name for what he was doing in the terms that Oscar used, and who had not needed to know it, because what he had was something older and more durable than vocabulary, which was the experience of what worked when the thing that was trying to kill you was serious about the job. She thought about Pavel, who had crossed an ocean to find land, and who had died in a rooming house in Brooklyn before he reached it, and she thought about the naturalization papers in the leather satchel, and about the land outside her door that was in her name, and that she had proven herself adequate to. Then she got up and went back to work. The work that spring was different from the work of the previous 2 springs. The previous springs had been the work of proving up a homestead claim, breaking ground and planting and cutting and storing, the solitary work of a single person trying to satisfy the requirements of the Homestead Act and establish a viable operation on a quarter section of Dakota River bottom land. This spring included that work, but it also included something she had not anticipated, which was people. Conrad Halverson came first in March, when the cold had eased enough that spending time outside was possible again. He came across the fence line on a morning when Vera was working on the expanded garden plot she was planning for the spring, and he stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at what she was doing, and he said, "I am going to need your help understanding how to build one of these systems in a log structure. Vera said it can be done." Conrad said, "I figured it could. I want to understand how." She put down her tools and they went into the dugout, and she showed him the drawings and explained what the modifications were for a structure built above ground, rather than into the earth where the thermal mass had to be built up, rather than dug into what that meant for the materials and the construction sequence and the time required. Conrad asked good questions. He was a practical man whose practical intelligence had been underestimated by no one who had spent time working alongside him, and the specific problem of adapting a system he could now see and feel and understand through direct experience to a structure he was already living in was a problem his practical intelligence was well suited to. He came back 3 more times in March before the construction season began, each time with more specific questions, each time adding to his understanding in the incremental way that real learning proceeds, not in sudden revelation, but in the patient accumulation of accurate detail. He never said he had been wrong. Conrad Halverson was not built for that particular statement. But he came back 3 times in March, and he came back across the fence line he had stood at the year before and told his neighbor she would not survive a winter alone, and each time he came he had his notebook with him, and he asked his questions, and he listened to the answers with the full weight of his attention. On his last visit in March, he stood at the top of the entry steps before he left and looked back at the interior of the dugout one more time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife said in May of 1874 that I should have listened to you. She was right." He walked back across the fence line. Vera stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then she went back inside. Cormac Driscoll rebuilt his cabin in the summer of 1877. He had lost 3 toes on his left foot permanently to the frostbite he had sustained during the storm, and he carried the knowledge of those 3 toes with him, the way a man carries the specific knowledge of what cold actually does, when it is serious, not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact that his body recorded in every step he took for the rest of his life. He was not going to have another winter like January of 1876 if any decision he made could prevent it. He dug the channels himself, following the drawings that Vera had made for him with measurements adapted to his cabin's footprint. He hauled limestone from the river bend in a borrowed wagon, the same limestone Vera had used, fitted the same way she had shown him, embedded in the same clay and sand, and cut straw matrix. He fired the system for the first time in September of 1877 and sat on the floor of his rebuilt cabin with his palm flat on the clay surface and felt what he felt. He burned 70% less wood that winter than he had burned in any previous winter in Pembina County. He did not make a speech about this. He told people when they asked, and he showed people who came to see, and when other homesteaders asked him to help them build their own systems, he helped them, because that was what you did on the frontier when someone needed something you knew how to do. Reverend Aldgate wrote his letters to Wisconsin. He sent the drawings Vera had allowed him to copy adapted to the dimensions that made sense for the structures his correspondents were working with, and he included in each letter the description of January 15th, 1876, the morning of the open door, and the 68 degrees, and the woman in her shirt sleeves, because that description was worth more than any technical specification for communicating what the system actually did when the weather outside was serious about what it intended. By the winter of 1877 to 1878, 14 homes in Pembina County were heated by variants of the system that Vera Strelkov had built into the earth of her River Bend claim in the summer and fall of 1874. Not identical to her system, the variants reflected the specific knowledge and materials and building traditions of the people who built them, German modifications and Norwegian interpretations, and the adaptations of men who had learned the principles and applied them to the structures they already had. But they all shared the same fundamental truth that Dmitri had built into his Saratov system, and that Vera had carried across an ocean in a roll of drawings, the truth that the earth is patient and heat is not, and that the way to stay warm in serious cold is to teach the fire to speak to the earth and then trust the earth to do its work. By 1880, there were 43 such structures in the county. Vera Strelkov proved up her homestead claim in 1879. She appeared at the land office in Grafton with her 5 years of improvement documentation, her cropped acreage records, her construction records, and Pavel's naturalization papers. And the clerk who processed her filing was not the same clerk who had laughed at Dmitri's drawings in 1874, and even if he had been there, would have been nothing to laugh about. She was one of the first single women in Pembina County to prove up successfully under the Homestead Act. Her success was noted in the county newspaper in a brief paragraph that described her as a Russian-born homesteader who had established a productive quarter-section claim on the Tongue River. The paragraph did not mention the heating system or the storm or the 63 steps or the open door and the wave of heat and the woman in her shirt sleeves. The people who had been there did not need it in the newspaper. The people who had not been there learned it the way frontier knowledge traveled from person to person and winter to winter and claim to claim in the form of specific actionable information passed between people who needed it. By 1885, there were 17 single women who had filed homestead claims within 10 miles of Vera's dugout. 12 of them built their structures with heating systems based on the drawings that had originated with Dmitri Strelkov in Saratov Oblast 30 years before they arrived. They built them because the information was available and because the evidence for the information was visible in the survival rates and the wood consumption figures of the people who had already built them. They built them because on the frontier, the difference between knowledge that worked and knowledge that did not work was not an academic distinction. Vera eventually built a proper above-ground house in 1882. She had the resources by then, 3 good crops and a successful commercial garden that she had developed by the river and that supplied vegetables to 3 other claims through the growing season. The house she built incorporated the channel system under the floor of both the main room and the bedroom, refined by 8 years of operating the dugout version, improved in the ways that 8 years of learning always improves a thing. She kept the dugout. She used it for storage through the summer and as a root cellar for the vegetables that sold best when they were cool and fresh. The thermal mass that had kept her alive through the worst winter in Pembina County's recorded history continued to release its patient heat into the space that no longer needed it for survival, which was perhaps its own kind of lesson about the relationship between preparation and outcome. She died in 1903 at the age of 60 during a winter that was mild enough that nobody in Pembina County needed exceptional heating to survive it. She had outlived Pavel by 29 years and Dmitri by longer than that, and she had outlived the specific conditions that had made her knowledge matter in the acute way it had mattered on January 12th through 15th, 1876. The railroad had come through and made coal available, and the brutal isolation of the early homestead years had given way to something more connected and less immediately mortal. But during the years when it mattered, during the years when a family's survival depended entirely on what they had built and what they had stored and what they understood about the specific properties of cold and heat and earth in the northern Dakota, Vera Strelkov's underground fire was the difference between the families who were warm and the families who were not. The land passed to a niece who had come from Russia in 1891 and who had grown up hearing stories about the Pechka in the American dugout the same way Vera had grown up hearing stories about Dmitri's Pechka on the Volga, which is the way knowledge travels when it travels well, not in textbooks or technical journals, but in the specific stories of specific people in specific places where the knowledge had mattered most. The dugout itself survived until 1946, when it was finally filled in, which means it stood for 72 years after the woman who built it was gone, which is what happens when something is built well for the conditions it was built for. What Vera Strelkov had done was not invent something new. Dmitri had not invented it either. The knowledge that Dmitri had built into his Saratov walls and floors, and that Vera had carried to Dakota in a roll of drawings, was knowledge that had been developed across centuries and across cultures, by people who faced the same problem and arrived at the same solution through different paths. It was knowledge that had kept people alive in Siberia and in Korea and in Scandinavia and in the steppes of Central Asia through winters that killed the unprepared. What she had done was carry it. She had carried it across an ocean and across a continent in a leather satchel with a dead man's naturalization papers, and she had pressed it into Dakota clay with her own hands in the summer of 1874, and she had operated it with the patience and precision that the system required through 2 winters before the winter that proved it, and she had not recanted it when the men around her explained why it was wrong. She had not recanted it because she had felt it working under her feet, because her grandfather had given her the knowledge, not as an abstraction, but as a practice, not as a theory, but as a thing you built with your hands and fired with wood. You had cut yourself and felt through the soles of your boots on a cold morning when the fire had been out for 10 hours and the floor was still warm. When the land office clerk in Grafton had laughed at the drawings in 1874, what he was laughing at was something he did not recognize. This is not a criticism of the clerk. Recognition requires a framework, and the framework available to a land office clerk in Grafton, Dakota Territory in 1874 was the framework of American frontier construction of above-ground structures and straight chimneys, and the 1,000-year-old Roman principle of pulling smoke upward and out. What Vera was showing him was outside that framework, and things outside a framework look like mistakes until the framework itself is the thing that fails. The framework failed on January 12, 1876, and the thing that had looked like a mistake kept one woman warm with less wood than her neighbors burned in a single morning of the storm that proved it. Dmitri built his fire beneath the earth of Saratov because that was where heat belonged, down in the stone and clay and sand stored and patient released slowly into the dark of Russian winters across the decades of his life. Vera carried his drawings to Dakota and pressed them into the river bend soil with her own hands, trusting what her grandfather had built and what the floor of his house had felt like under her small hands when she was 10 years old, trusting it across an ocean and a continent, and 18 months of her neighbors telling her she was wrong. And when the worst storm in a generation came screaming down from Canada, when the temperature dropped to 43 below and the wind hit 57 miles per hour, and the chimneys that should have drawn reversed their physics and became liabilities instead of assets, when the knowledge that had kept every experienced homesteader in Pembina County alive through every previous winter proved to be knowledge built for conditions that were not. These conditions the fire that had been built underground, the one everyone had called wrong and backwards and dangerous, and a waste of good stone kept one woman warm with less wood than her neighbors burned in a single morning. That is not luck, that is not stubbornness, that is what it looks like when knowledge is carried carefully across time and distance and trusted completely in the moment when the cold arrives, and the moment has no interest in what you believed before it came.